time for Q&A. So Jonathan, what's interesting this week?
All right, for me, I have an article that's actually from a week or so ago from Georgia. Pandemic could lessen Georgia legislators' incumbency advantage. And the reason I thought that was interesting, for those that don't know, an incumbent is the elected official currently holding the office in an election. And then we talk about their opponent as the challenger. And as you might know, incumbents have a very strong re-election advantage. In fact, I was doing some research last year, and I had seen that in New Jersey, from what I understood, no incumbent had lost a primary challenge for like 3 or 4 election cycles. Just crazy numbers. And why is that? Because name identification in a lot of cases is way more valuable than dollars. And so this article is implying, because it's in some states like Georgia, they cannot raise money during legislative session, but incumbents cannot. Session is not officially ended, they just paused it. Normally it would have ended by now. So the primary's in June, so Georgia legislators are not able to raise money before their primary election. And the article is implying that there's a disadvantage for incumbents because their opponents can go raise whatever they want right now. They, however, cannot raise any money until session reconvenes and then adjourns, which probably is not going to happen before the primary in Georgia. So they're saying opponents have a leg up on the incumbent. My feedback on that is maybe in a few cases, isolated cases, but I think you have to look at the bigger picture. One is opponents usually beat incumbents in these situations by outworking them. And opponents can't door knock. That's the bread and butter in these races of how they beat incumbents. They get out and talk to the voters, and that's not happening. Second of all, any incumbent who's halfway decent has been raising money for a long period of time. And so losing the last month or so of their fundraising cycle shouldn't be a detriment for most of them. And then lastly, I think in the isolated cases, it might hurt, but my assertion would be it's probably cases where the incumbent was already in trouble in their primary. And so it is a thing, but I don't think it's quite the dilemma that they're trying to make out in the article. I don't know, Christian, what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, on the surface, right, it sounds scary. It sounds, my opponent can raise money, can go out there and work. But in the world we're living in, no one can knock doors, which means you're going to throw all your money into TV or into mail. And we'll talk more in depth about the pros and cons of all of those. I see someone from here from Murmuration, and they can speak more to the effectiveness of mail and field and all that. But I think you're right. I think not being able to be out in the field from going to like Rotary clubs to knocking on doors, that really just levels the playing field, and it comes down to name ID. So I'm with you. This is a sexy headline. I think in any other time, this would have been a huge deal. But in the time we're living in, I think it's kind of a moot point.
But for you, you're what interesting. I'll go to you now. Has a little tie to Georgia too. Why don't you talk about what you think is interesting?
Yeah, so I'm sharing this article. It's actually a tweet from the New York Times reporter. And he's sharing how Al Sharpton, behind closed doors, is pushing Joe Biden to advocating for Stacey Abrams, but also for Kamala Harris. And the reason I picked this article is that I think this is a perfect vision of mastery for what we're going to be talking about the next 6 weeks, is really leveraging your advocacy to electoral power. And no one was doing it better for the last 3 to 4 decades than Al Sharpton. And I think this is another case in point. Al Sharpton is leveraging his name ID, his several years of popularity and community engagement to get an African-American vice presidential candidate. And so the claim that the article goes on to make is that Joe Biden really needs to pick an African-American woman to be a VP to really energize and mobilize the African-American vote that he'll need to get to 270 this November. This article goes on to say that actually there was a poll done by the Washington Post that said 74% of Democratic African-Americans said that picking an African-American candidate as the vice president nominee isn't important to them. It's not going to be a deciding factor whether or not they vote for the candidate. And so this is kind of, again, this goes to the importance of leveraging your power and having a vision of mastery. The other reason I wanted to drop this in there is because we'll get to this in a few weeks, but polling, how important is polling? Because Joe Biden can come back and say, look at this, 74% of people are going to be with me no matter who I pick. And then the other thing is, like, again, going back to the goal this week is, like, how do you know your candidate's with you, right? Joe Biden has gone out and made proclamation that he's going to be an ally to the African-American communities, to all communities of color, Latino and African-American. And so this is Al Sharpton putting his feet to the fire and saying, show me, don't just tell me that you're going to be with us. And so this kind of leads us to our next polling question here, just for fun. And that is, who do you think Joe Biden should pick as his vice presidential nominee?
Yeah, I know for a fact that Joe's watching this poll closely, so weigh in. I think that I feel like vice presidential candidates are always surprises. Maybe not always, but to me, it's always a name I hadn't heard or thought of. So my answer to this poll would be other. I don't know if, like, presidents don't like overly ambitious candidates who are being overt about their interests. Maybe that's part of it. I don't know, but my take is other. So.
Yeah, I would typically agree with you, but I have this hypothesis that all of our news is now nationalized. Everything is nationalized. No one's looking at their local paper anymore. No one's really looking at local news. It is the big three Goliaths that they watch if they watch the news. And so my personal opinion is that polling will dictate who this is. I think Joe Biden needs to find whoever's going to excite the group of people that aren't with him, which as of right now, it's young people. So I think he's going to rely simply on polling. Who's going to give him to 270? And I find this fascinating. It's a split between Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams. My pick, not because of, like, absent of, like, who I think would be the best.
This is nonpartisan. This is your professional advice. Yeah.
I think Elizabeth Warren has the name ID to get the base of people who Joe Biden is struggling with, which is young people, people of color. I think she has a name ID and the essentially taglines to get them excited. I think because of the COVID thing, someone like Stacey Abrams, who has an amazing resume, I think the news coverage the way it is, you can't break her name ID up into the echelons. She can't go on Ellen. She can't go on Oprah the way we used to be able to get candidates on television and get their name ID and their story out there. So I think someone like Stacey Abrams is going to be struggling when it comes to polling.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Well, everyone got to see our poll here and where people are. Thanks for chiming in, and we'll pass on the information to Joe and go from there. So, we're going to kick off now. Get in the